What if I told you that a black woman walked into a police station one morning, and within minutes she was insulted, humiliated, ignored, and then punched in the face by the very officer sworn to protect her? What if I told you that the man who hit her laughed afterward because he believed she was powerless, worthless, invisible? And what if I told you that he had just punched the new chief of police? This is not just a story, it is a wound, a mirror, a painful reflection of what still happens behind closed doors when racism, power, and unchecked authority collide. Because on that morning in that lobby, we watch more than a punch. We witness a culture reveal itself. We witness silence become violence. We witness exactly why so many people fear a badge that should protect them. But we also witness something unforgettable. A woman who refuses to break. A leader who rises from the floor with dignity still intact. A moment that cracks open an entire system and forces a city and a nation to look at itself honestly. And believe me, when her true identity is revealed, every officer in that room and everyone watching will feel their heart stop. If you want stories that expose the truth, confront injustice, and remind us why we must stand together against racism, then you are in the right place. Make sure you subscribe to the Racist Reality channel, because what you're about to see will change the way you understand power, justice, and humanity in America. Now, let's begin. She walked in as a nobody. The morning light in Birmingham felt strange that day, soft but heavy, as if the sun itself hesitated to shine on a place still wrestling with its own shadow. The city carried a long memory: marches, fire hoses, broken promises, whispered prayers. And yet, beneath all that history, something colder lingered, something quieter than hatred, but no less dangerous. It lived in sideways glances, in tone, in neglect. It lived in places like the lobby of the Birmingham Police Department. Danielle Brooks stood outside its glass doors, breathing in the thick Alabama air. She straightened her blazer, not the formal uniform she would wear later, but simple and unremarkable clothing chosen with intention. Today was her first step inside the building as the newly appointed chief of police, but she didn't want anyone to know that yet. She wanted to see who they really were when no one important was watching. And maybe if she was honest with herself, she wanted to test something deeper, whether this place, this institution, could still be saved. She pushed open the door. The fluorescent buzz overhead greeted her like a disinterested sigh. Conversations hummed lazily across the room. Casual chatter, small talk, jokes that didn't reach the eyes. A coffee machine sputtered in the background, filling the air with the burnt scent of an old pot. No one noticed her. That was the first truth of the day. To them, black women often entered unseen. A man sat in a plastic chair by the wall, a black man in his 50s, nerves twisting his fingers together. He looked like he'd been waiting a long time. Danielle saw the worry in his eyes, the way he leaned forward every time a uniform walked by, hoping someone would acknowledge him. But no one did. Near the reception desk, two white officers leaned against the counter, sipping coffee and talking as though the room were their private lounge. One of them noticed the anxious man and snorted. "Another one of them," he murmured to his colleague. "There are always some problems." His companion smirked but didn't reply. Danielle felt a slow ache bloom inside her chest. Not surprise, not anger, just a deep and familiar sadness. This wasn't a shocking moment. It was an ordinary one. That made it worse. She approached the front desk. The young officer behind it didn't look up. His attention was swallowed by his phone, thumbs tapping mindlessly. Danielle waited patiently, giving him time to choose professionalism. He didn't. Only after several seconds did he finally drag his eyes upward. He gave her one quick glance, just enough to assess her and dismiss her, then asked in a tone devoid of even basic courtesy, "Yeah? What do you need?" Danielle's voice remained calm. "I'm here to see human resources." He didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't offer direction. He simply turned back to his phone, effectively erasing her from the room. She watched him for a moment, studying the careless posture, the apathy, the entitlement. This wasn't about one rude officer. This was about the culture that told him he could behave this way, the culture she had been hired to change. But they didn't know that yet. She stepped back slightly, letting the moment settle in her mind. Every disrespect, every microaggression, every cold dismissal, these things mattered. They shaped how citizens were treated. They shaped how officers saw themselves. They shaped the very soul of policing. And when the soul is sick, everyone suffers. The door behind Danielle opened again, letting in a wave of chatter as a group of officers entered. Laughing, loud, confident. The kind of confidence born not from pride in serving a community, but from knowing the system would always protect them. Danielle's instincts sharpened. She recognized this type immediately. Men who held leadership not because they had earned it, but because their arrogance filled up all the space where integrity should be. She had worked her entire career surrounded by men like this. They never scared her. They only reminded her why she kept fighting. She didn't turn to face them completely. She only listened. Their jokes were crude, careless. Their laughter carried no respect for the building they walked into, no reverence for the badge on their chests. Disrespect wasn't just for the citizens. It lived among them too. And then she felt it. A heavier presence, a shift in the air. Footsteps, slow, purposeful, authoritative. She didn't need to look to know someone important to them, at least, was approaching. The room itself seemed to react, as though the other officers were subtly straightening up, adjusting themselves, preparing to be seen. A deep voice cut through the room. "What exactly is going on here?" Danielle turned. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds stood a few feet away, tall, broad, his expression carved from irritation and ego. His uniform was immaculate, his movements sharp, his stare hard and assessing. And in that instant, Danielle understood him completely. He was the kind of man who believed leadership was his birthright, the kind of man who believed respect belonged only to him, the kind of man who interpreted confidence in a black woman as defiance. His gaze swept over her with the careless assumption that he held all the power in the room. He didn't see her calm. He didn't see her strength. He didn't see the decades of service or the battles she'd fought to get here. He saw only what he'd been conditioned to see, a black woman who didn't belong. Danielle held his gaze without flinching. The room felt suddenly smaller, the fluorescent lights harsher. Something electric stirred between them, silent but powerful. Not hatred, not fear, not yet. Just a collision of two realities that had been on a crash course long before today. Mark Reynolds didn't know it yet, but the path he had walked so confidently for years was about to crumble under his feet. And Danielle Brooks, the woman he hadn't even bothered to acknowledge properly, was the one holding the match. She didn't speak. Not yet. She didn't need to. At that moment, without a badge, without a name, without a title, she had already changed the room, because she saw everything. And soon they would see her too. A city with open wounds, Birmingham had always been a city of contrast, brave voices echoing through churches and streets, and yet whispers of old prejudices lingering behind polished walls. To outsiders, the city had moved forward. They pointed to renovated downtown blocks, new businesses, and speeches about equality. But to the people who lived here, to those who felt history in their bones, Birmingham's wounds never fully healed. They simply learned to hide under fresh layers of paint. Inside the police department, those wounds were not only visible, they were alive. Danielle stood in that lobby, feeling the weight of the institution pressing down like humidity before a thunderstorm. It wasn't just the way the officer ignored her. It wasn't just the cruel whisper aimed at the black man waiting silently for help. It was the atmosphere, the quiet confidence of men who believed their authority was unquestionable, and the helpless expectation of those who knew they would not be treated fairly. This city was not unique, but it was symbolic. For decades, policing here had followed a pattern, an unspoken hierarchy shaped by history, culture, and generational bias. People didn't talk about it openly, but everyone knew. White officers rose faster. Black officers worked twice as hard to be seen. Complaints vanished quietly. Accountability rarely traveled upward. And while the department occasionally updated its slogans, community trust, equal protection, policing with heart, The spirit inside the building didn't always match the posters on the walls. Danielle knew these truths intimately. She had lived them, fought against them, and endured them her entire career. But stepping into Birmingham's department was different. The tension was thicker, older. It was a place where tradition was both shield and sword, and where too many people believed the old ways were safer than change. She didn't blame the entire city. Birmingham wasn't full of bad people. It was full of people who had inherited broken systems and never questioned them. Systems where silence was rewarded and courage was punished. Systems where racism didn't need to shout because it lived in policy, in preference, in comfort. But it wasn't enough to understand the system. She had to change it. And that meant meeting its roots face to face. The mayor and city council had taken a bold risk appointing her as chief. It wasn't common for a black woman, especially one known for her firmness, to be entrusted with reshaping a department this troubled. Some called her appointment historic. Others, especially those inside the force, whispered different words: political stunt, symbolic move, temporary distraction, and a few muttered something worse. She won't last. Danielle had heard all these things long before her first day. Rumors traveled quickly in institutions like this. They leaked out through veterans who feared losing their hold on the department, through supervisors who didn't want oversight, through officers who believed leadership belonged to a very specific type of person. Not her. That was why she chose to come unannounced. Not as chief, not as authority, not as a symbol of new power, but as a black woman walking into a building that had always questioned the right of people like her to belong. And what she saw confirmed exactly why she needed to. It wasn't long before she began noticing the deeper cracks in the foundation. A poster promoting diversity in leadership hung crooked near the hallway, old, faded, half peeling at the corner. Underneath it, the real leadership photos lined the wall. Rows of faces, nearly all white, mostly male. Officers walked past it every day, barely glancing at the contradiction. Near the break room, she overheard fragments of a conversation between two mid-level officers. This new chief nonsense. Another experiment from the mayor's office. Can't wait until things go back to normal. The words weren't surprising, but they revealed how deeply resistance had already rooted itself. Danielle wasn't naive. She understood the psychology of institutions. People didn't fear change because it was wrong. They feared it because it demanded accountability, because it forced them to look in mirrors they avoided for years. For officers like these, equality felt like loss, respect felt like threat, and a black woman in charge felt like rebellion. But the city needed this rebellion. It needed someone willing to disrupt old comfort. As she walked deeper into the building, Danielle allowed herself to feel not just the weight of the task, but the weight of the people who depended on her. Mothers who taught their sons to keep their hands visible. Fathers who warned their daughters not to trust certain uniforms. Young men who avoided calling 911 even when they needed help. Young officers of color who learned to lower their gaze and keep their heads down to survive. She had been all of them at different points in her life. Every step she took echoed with their voices. Every fluorescent hallway carried the stories she'd promised to fight for. Every indifferent stare reminded her of what she had survived to reach this moment. She passed an open conference room where a group of officers were gathered around a table reviewing case files. Their conversation was casual, unaffected, comfortable in a way that signaled they were used to being the center of the department's culture. A younger officer glanced up as she walked by, curiosity flickering in his eyes. But then he quickly looked away, as though acknowledging her would break some unspoken hierarchy. Danielle knew that look. It said, "We don't know who you are, but we know you don't matter here." She kept walking, not visibly shaken, but emotionally sharpened. Pain didn't weaken her. It clarified her purpose. At the end of the hallway, a door marked Training and Ethics was left slightly ajar. Inside, dusty manuals lay stacked on a shelf. The top one was titled Bias Awareness and Community Engagement, though its spine was stiff enough to suggest it had rarely been open. A tragic irony. Training wasn't the problem, culture was. And culture didn't change because of paperwork. It changed because people in power were forced to confront themselves. She stepped back into the main lobby. The black man from earlier was still waiting, still unnoticed. still hoping for help that had not come. Something inside her tightened. She wanted to help him, to step in, to say, "You matter. I see you." But doing so now, before her identity was revealed, would shift the trajectory of what she needed to learn about this place. So instead, she silently stored the moment in her heart, a reminder of what injustice looked like in everyday life. Not dramatic, not violent, just cold, too cold. And then she heard it. Laughter, sharp, careless laughter from across the room. She turned and saw Lieutenant Mark Reynolds standing with a pair of officers who seemed eager to earn his approval. His posture was relaxed, his confidence absolute. He looked like a man certain of his territory, certain of his dominance, certain that no one could ever challenge him. He didn't see her yet, but she saw him clearly. She recognized the type instantly, not because she'd met him before, but because every department had a Mark Reynolds. They were the self-appointed gatekeepers of tradition, men who believed equality was erosion, men who believed their authority came not from service, but from identity, men who treated people as less because they believed themselves more. And though he had not yet spoken to her, Danielle could feel it. This was the heart of the problem. Not one man, but what he represented. And inside this building, what he represented had power. For now. Danielle inhaled deeply, centering herself. She had entered this department undercover to see the truth. Now she had seen enough to understand. The building wasn't just flawed. It wasn't just outdated. It wasn't just slow to change. It was bleeding. Bleeding trust. Bleeding integrity. Bleeding humanity. And a wound like that did not heal quietly. It required confrontation, courage, and leadership rooted in something deeper than authority. Leadership rooted in love, fairness, in the belief that a broken system can still be rebuilt. She straightened her shoulders, because the next step, the confrontation she already felt forming, would test everything she believed in. And the city she loved needed her to face it without fear. Danielle Brooks versus the system. There were moments in a person's life that were not chosen, but inherited. Moments that came from years of struggle, from history, from the quiet battles fought in silence. As Danielle Brooks stood in the center of the Birmingham Police Department, watching officers move through the building as though it belonged only to them, she felt the weight of her own past pressing against the present. She had not become a leader by accident. She had not survived the system because it had been kind to her. She had survived because she refused to be broken by it. And yet, even now at 42, with more experience than most officers in the building combined, she could feel the same familiar tension that had followed her since the beginning of her career. The tension that came from being a Black woman, stepping into a world that was never designed for her. Danielle hadn't always dreamed of becoming a police officer. When she was young, she dreamed of building something, maybe a community center, maybe a nonprofit, maybe a safe space where kids like her little brother could come after school instead of wandering into danger. But life had a way of reshaping dreams. She remembered the day she watched officers push her 13-year-old brother against the hood of a patrol car because he fit the description, which was another way of saying he was Black, breathing, and nearby. That moment burned into her memory like a scar. She remembered the look in his eyes, not fear, but betrayal, as though he realized for the first time that the world had rules he had never agreed to. That was the day she understood what she wanted to fight. Not criminals, not communities, not neighborhoods, but injustice. Years later, when she entered the academy, she discovered something she hadn't expected. She was good at policing, not because she barked orders or sought power, but because she listened, because she cared, because she could walk into a room full of tension and ease it without a weapon, because she could look into someone's eyes and see their humanity before their mistakes. But that didn't mean the journey was simple. Her instructors doubted her. Her classmates underestimated her. Her early supervisors dismissed her accomplishments as luck. She learned quickly that law enforcement was a world where Black officers were tolerated but rarely uplifted, where women were respected only when they were silent, and where being both Black and a woman meant you had to prove yourself twice as hard to be believed half as much. But Danielle didn't walk away. She rose, quietly, deliberately, unapologetically. Every precinct she worked in left her with more stories, Stories of neighborhoods longing for safety, of families begging for fairness, of officers trying their best but bound by culture, of others who had no interest in serving anyone but themselves. She learned to navigate the politics of policing, the fragile egos, the unspoken rules. She learned when to speak and when silence protected her. She learned the difference between humility and erasure. She learned that courage was sometimes quieter than people expected. 22 years had passed since she entered the force, and now she was chief, the first black woman to ever lead Birmingham's department. A title that should have been a celebration felt instead like a summons, a demand from the universe that she confront everything she had ever feared and everything she had ever hoped for. But standing there, surrounded by the indifferent faces of officers who didn't know her yet and didn't care to, she realized something profound. This department didn't need a chief with authority. It needed a chief with courage. Danielle took a slow breath, letting her gaze sweep across the room. Somewhere deeper in the building, phones rang, printers hummed, conversations drifted like background noise. But under that noise lived something heavier: resentment, resistance, reluctance. She could feel it in the way officers leaned in toward one another when she passed. She could feel it in the way the receptionist ignored the black man waiting for help. She could feel it in the hallway where officers whispered their doubts about her. She could feel it in the confident stride of Lieutenant Mark Reynolds approaching her. This environment wasn't simply flawed, it was protective of itself, a system designed to remain unchanged, a culture that resisted accountability, a brotherhood that viewed reform as betrayal. She knew that challenging such a culture wasn't a matter of policy or memos. It required people to confront uncomfortable truths they had long avoided. But she also knew something else. Not everyone inside this building was corrupt. Not everyone resisted change for malicious reasons. Some resisted because they were afraid of being exposed, afraid of losing status, afraid of acknowledging harm they never meant to cause. Danielle understood fear. She had lived alongside it her entire life. But she had also learned to walk through it. A group of trainees walked past her, young, hopeful, unaware of the storm waiting to shape them. She saw their curiosity flicker when they looked at her. They didn't see a chief. They saw a stranger. But in their eyes, she saw possibility, potential waiting to be nurtured. If she failed here, these young officers would learn the old patterns and repeat them. If she succeeded, they would help create something new. This was the part of policing she loved, the chance to break cycles, to rewrite expectations, to plant seeds that would grow long after she was gone. But none of that could happen until she confronted the old guard, and that confrontation was coming. She felt it gathering like an approaching storm. She saw it in Mark Reynolds' expression as he crossed the room, a mixture of arrogance and annoyance that hardened his face. She had not spoken to him yet, but she had already studied him. Everything about him, from the sharp posture to the dismissive gaze, reflected a man who felt threatened by change, a man who believed leadership belonged only to those who looked like him, a man who saw respect as something owed, not earned. But what struck Danielle most was not his posture, but the way everyone around him shifted subtly when he entered, straightening, quieting, glancing at him for approval. Fear disguised as loyalty. She had seen that dynamic in every broken department she'd ever worked in. Leaders like Reynolds didn't need to shout. They didn't need to threaten. Their power came from the silence surrounding them. And silence was how systems survived. But silence was not how systems healed. Danielle walked farther into the building, allowing herself a moment to absorb everything she had witnessed so far. The dismissive receptionist, the cruel joke about the waiting man, the whispers of resentment, the mismatched posters on the walls, the officers who ignored her presence, the officers who watched her with judgment. The building itself felt divided into two worlds: the world the public believed existed, professional, fair, committed to justice, and the world that actually existed, chaotic, biased, unwilling to change. To bridge those worlds, someone had to carry the burden of both. She had accepted that burden, but she had not expected to feel it this deeply. Not on her first day, not before anyone even knew her name. She thought of her mother then, her quiet strength, her gentle wisdom. Her mother used to say, "Sometimes God puts you where people are broken because he knows you carry healing in your hands." Danielle didn't know if she believed that entirely, but she believed something close to it. You stand where you are needed most. And she was needed here. More than she realized. More than anyone in this building yet understood. She reached a corner of the lobby where a glass case displayed memorabilia from past chiefs, badges, medals, plaques with engraved names. Men who had shaped the department through eras of civil rights battles, protests, reforms, scandals, and rebuilding. All of them white, all of them male. Danielle didn't envy them. She didn't resent them. She respected the legacy even if she disagreed with the culture that had grown around it. But as she looked at the long line of faces staring back at her, she felt the gravity of her role settle firmly onto her shoulders. She was not here to replace tradition. She was here to transform it, to make room where there had never been room before, to open doors that had long been locked, to remind this department that justice wasn't a slogan, it was a responsibility. And she understood something profound in that moment. Change never begins with acceptance. It begins with resistance. And the resistance she felt in this building was the clearest sign that change was overdue. A voice broke through her thoughts, deep, sharp, impatient. "Ma'am, I asked you a question." Danielle turned. Lieutenant Reynolds now stood directly in front of her, and the confrontation that would expose everything wrong inside this department had finally begun. A test of humanity. Failed, the moment Lieutenant Mark Reynolds stepped toward her, the air seemed to tighten, as if even the walls of the Birmingham Police Department sensed the anxiety curling beneath the surface. Danielle didn't move. She held her ground, her posture composed, her expression calm. But inside she felt the quiet rise of something heavy, an emotion she knew all too well. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. Reynolds stood with a confidence sharpened by years of unchallenged authority. His voice carried a tone perfected through repetition, the tone of a man who expected obedience long before he earned it. "I asked you a question," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "What are you doing here?" Danielle met his gaze the way she had met countless others like his across her 22 years in law enforcement. Steady, respectful, unreadable. "I'm here to see human resources," she replied softly. Her voice was calm, steady, but it did not matter. Not to him. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth lifting in a smirk that did not reach his eyes. It was a smirk of dismissal, not amusement. A smirk that communicated exactly what he thought she was worth. "HR," he repeated, the word lingering on his tongue with condescension. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Danielle held her breath for a brief second, not to suppress anger, but to acknowledge the pain behind the moment. The script of this interaction was painfully familiar. She'd experienced versions of it as a young officer, as a detective, even as a captain. Somehow the disbelief always returned, circling her identity like a vulture hungry for weakness. Reynolds didn't wait for her to respond. He scanned her clothing, her posture, her skin. No badge, no uniform, no introduction. To him, that could only mean one thing. She didn't belong here. "Look," he said, shifting his weight and folding his arms across his chest. "I'm not sure what kind of paperwork you're talking about, but HR doesn't exactly have time for cases like yours." Cases like yours. The words sank into the floor like a drop of cold water. Danielle didn't react outwardly. She'd learned long ago that some insults weren't meant to be answered. They were meant to expose the speaker. In the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. Several officers who had been lingering near the reception area had turned to watch. Their expressions ranged from amusement to indifference, but not one of them looked confused. Not one looked troubled. Not one wondered whether Reynolds was crossing a line. This was normal. This was how things were done. The young receptionist who'd ignored her earlier now glanced up, interest piqued not by professionalism, but by conflict. Even the anxious man still sitting in the waiting area leaned forward, though he seemed afraid to be caught watching. Danielle inhaled, her chest rising with a quiet patience she had perfected over years of surviving spaces not meant for her. "I'm here for administrative procedures," she said again. "I just need to see HR." Reynolds scoffed loudly, turning slightly so that those around him could hear the derision in his voice. "This is the police department, not a welfare office," he snapped. "If you're looking for that kind of help, you're in the wrong building." A few officers chuckled under their breath. Danielle's gaze remained steady. She refused to let her spirit shrink under his words. "I'm talking about police administrative procedures," she clarified gently, "not welfare." But her calm tone only seemed to provoke him more. He stepped closer, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat of his breath. His eyes sharpened, studying her not with curiosity but with predatory interest. "Oh, I get it," he muttered, voice low. "You're one of those people who come here to monitor the police, right? One of those activists." Behind him, a small group of officers snickered. "Guys," he called over his shoulder, "anyone want to help this lady file her activist paperwork?" Laughter rippled through the room, soft from some, loud from others. But the most painful part wasn't the laughter itself. It was the silence from those who knew better, the ones who avoided eye contact, who shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Silence, Danielle knew, could be as violent as words. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She watched the room closely. Some officers looked entertained. Some looked annoyed. Some looked away. None looked ashamed. She exhaled slowly, not to calm herself, but to remain present. "I need to see the HR team leader," she said. Her tone was firmer this time, but still respectful, still controlled. Reynolds' posture stiffened at her confidence. He squinted, lips tightening into a thin line. "For what?" he demanded. "Because I have the right to," she replied. And there it was, the word he hated, the word that threatened him more than anything else, the word he believed did not apply equally to all people. Right. Reynolds took a slow step forward. "No one here is obligated to do anything for you," he said coldly, "especially not someone walking in here acting like they've got authority." The surrounding officers laughed again, louder this time, emboldened by his cruelty. But Danielle didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on Reynolds, studying the way his jaw clenched, the way his fists tightened slightly, the way his ego ballooned the more attention he drew. She had seen men like him lose control before. She knew how far they could go when challenged. But she also knew one fundamental truth. When you stand your ground calmly, bullies show their true selves. And Reynolds was already revealing his. "If you cannot help me," she said quietly, "then please call someone who can." Her voice was soft, but it struck him like a challenge. His face hardened. His nostrils flared. The room felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for the spark. "Are you ordering me around?" he growled. "No," Danielle said firmly. "I'm asking for a service that any citizen has the right to request." Reynolds stepped even closer, closing the space until only a foot remained between them. His shadow fell over her, but his presence did not intimidate her. "You should leave," he warned, "before something happens." The threat was unmistakable. So was the silence that followed. The officers who had been laughing moments earlier were now quieter, still watching, still complicit, but beginning to sense the danger building in the room. Danielle did not step back. She did not break eye contact. She simply asked again, "I won't leave until I see the person I came here to see." Reynolds exhaled through his teeth, the sound sharp and angry. "Fine," he snapped. "You want to meet someone? Great. I'll introduce you to someone you're going to regret meeting." He motioned to one of the officers standing nearby. "Get her out of here," Reynolds ordered. The officer hesitated, his expression tightening with doubt. "Lieutenant, I said get her out," Reynolds barked, his voice suddenly booming through the lobby. The officer stepped toward Danielle reluctantly, but she didn't move. She didn't run. She didn't resist. She simply stood with the quiet strength of someone who had survived far worse moments than this. The tension in the room peaked as Reynolds glared at her, offended, challenged, furious. The other officers watched like spectators at a spectacle they'd seen too many times to care about. But something was different, something none of them recognized yet. Danielle wasn't just a woman refusing to leave. She wasn't just someone demanding fairness. She wasn't just a black woman standing tall in the face of racism. She was the incoming chief of police, the highest-ranking officer in the entire building, a leader who had come to transform the very culture that now mocked her. But they didn't know that. Not yet. Reynolds took another step forward, his face inches from hers. He didn't see her strength. He didn't see her purpose. He didn't see the storm quietly gathering behind her calm eyes. He saw only what he wanted to see, someone he believed he could break. But Danielle didn't bend. And in the stillness of that moment, in the quiet courage of her refusal, she delivered a message no one else in the room understood yet. There are battles worth fighting even when you stand alone. Especially when you stand alone. The test of humanity had begun, and everyone in the room had already failed. The clash. Racist power meets silent strength. The room felt suspended, as if every breath taken inside the Birmingham Police Department waited for permission from Lieutenant Mark Reynolds. His stare bore into Danielle Brooks like a spotlight, searching for guilt, searching for weakness, searching for any sign that she might back down. But Danielle didn't move. She stood in place with a stillness that came not from fear, but from discipline. A discipline carved through years of surviving disrespect, dismissal, and danger. Reynolds, on the other hand, was losing his patience. Not because she posed a threat, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had failed to shrink. "Are you going out on your own?" he said, voice tightening. "Or do I need to take more drastic measures?" His tone wasn't loud, but it carried through the room like a knife sliding across glass. Officers shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other, some looking away. There was a tension in the air now, different from the earlier laughter, more dangerous, more electric. Danielle kept her voice calm, perfectly steady. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I will wait for HR." The moment the words left her mouth, something flickered in Reynolds' eyes. Not surprised, he'd already seen her defiance. It was offense, violation, an injury to his authority. "How many times do I have to repeat myself?" he snapped. He took another step toward her, close enough that she could smell the bitter coffee on his breath. The officers behind him leaned in subtly, sensing a confrontation but unwilling to intervene. Some watched with curiosity, some with enjoyment, some with silent discomfort. But no one spoke. No one told him to stop. Not one person stood on the side of justice. Danielle exhaled quietly, grounding herself. She'd been in rooms like this before. Rooms where the wrong person held power, where the wrong decisions were made, where silence protected cruelty. She wasn't surprised, but she was disappointed. Disappointment, she knew, was often the first sign of moral clarity. Reynolds' lips curled into a sneer. "You really want to test me today," he said. "You really think you can come in here, disrespect our procedures, and tell us what to do?" "I didn't disrespect anyone," Danielle answered gently. "I simply asked for assistance." He scoffed loudly. "Assistance? Lady, what you need is direction, and I'm giving it to you. Leave." His voice rose on the last word, sharp, arrogant, commanding. But Danielle remained steady. "Sir," she said softly, "I'm asking for nothing more than what any citizen deserves." Her tone wasn't challenging. It was dignified. It embarrassed him more than any insult could have. Reynolds' jaw clenched, his face flushing slightly. He wasn't used to people challenging him, especially not black women. In his mind, authority flowed from him, not toward him, not around him. Him. This woman, this unassuming, calm, determined woman, was unraveling that illusion thread by thread without even raising her voice. He snapped. "I'm done wasting time," he growled. He turned sharply toward the officers standing behind him. "Take her out, now!" The officers hesitated. One of them, a younger man in his late 20s, stepped forward slowly. His face tightened with conflict. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "maybe we should just—" "Just what?" Reynolds barked, spinning around. "You questioning orders now? I told you to remove her. Do it." The young officer swallowed hard. He didn't want to do this. That much was clear, but he also didn't want to challenge the lieutenant. Fear beat out moral courage, something Danielle had seen happen far too often. He took another reluctant step forward. Danielle raised a hand slightly, not as a threat, but as a gentle signal. "It's all right," she said softly to him. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I only want to speak to HR." But her calmness only enraged Reynolds further. Oh, you think you're clever, he snapped. Trying to make me look unreasonable? You? He pointed a finger at her chest. You don't get to come in here and act like you run the place. Danielle held his gaze. I never said I did, she replied. But the truth, unspoken, unknown to him, hung in the air like a prophecy. Reynolds didn't know it yet, but he was pointing at the new chief of police. Silence stretched across the room. The receptionist set down his phone, sensing something escalating. Officers who had been leaning against the desk now straightened. Even the waiting man in the corner looked terrified, not for himself, but for the woman he had watched and endure humiliation with grace. Reynolds took one more step forward, invading her space. You need to understand how things work around here, he said in a low voice. People don't come in and demand anything. Not from me, not from my department. Danielle's heart tightened, not from fear, but from the clarity of his words. My department. Men like Reynolds believed institutions belonged to them, not to the community, not to the people they swore to serve, not even to the law, to them. She spoke carefully, choosing words that reflected dignity, not defiance. I'm not demanding anything, she said. I am simply asking. Reynolds cut her off. No, you're done asking. His voice boomed across the room. You're leaving, right now. She didn't move. And that stillness, more than any argument, more than any protest, shattered what little control he believed he had. A frustrated sound escaped his throat. He ran a hand through his graying hair, pacing one step away, then pivoting back sharply. You don't get it, he said. I'm trying to help you. The lie was so blatant, so transparent, that even the laughing officers fell silent. He took another step toward her. Danielle remained unshaken. Sir, she said gently, I have the right to be here. The word again. Right. It was too much. Reynolds' face twisted. Do you think because you watched some documentary last night, you can walk in here and throw the word right around like it means something? A few officers snickered, nervously this time, not confidently. Reynolds didn't notice. He was too wrapped in his own anger, too intoxicated by the feeling of dominance he thought he was losing. You want rights? He snapped. Then follow mine. Leave. But Danielle stood still. Her silence, her composure, her refusal to be intimidated. It enraged him more deeply than words ever could. He stepped so close she could feel the tension radiating off him. This is your last chance, he said. Walk out on your own. She didn't move. Her restraint was not a weakness. It was a principle. It was dignity. It was the quiet strength of someone who had known oppression but refused to bow to it. And that was the moment Reynolds lost all restraint. He reached out and grabbed her arm. Rough, forceful, fingers digging into her skin, not as a police officer in control, but as a man furious that someone dared to disobey him. The room froze. Gasps, wide eyes, sudden stillness. Even the officers who had been laughing now felt something shift, something dangerous, something irreversible. Danielle's breath caught in her chest from the pressure of his grip, but she didn't panic. Years of training kept her centered. She knew that reacting physically would escalate the situation, and she refused to give him that satisfaction. But she could feel the pain blooming beneath his fingers, pain she had experienced before, pain she thought she'd left behind in her early years on the force, pain she had hoped newer generations of officers would never inflict. Reynolds yanked her toward the exit. I warned you, he hissed. But before he could drag her further, Danielle steadied herself and used a simple, controlled motion to break free from his grip. Not aggressive, not violent, just firm enough to reclaim her arm. It startled him. A woman, this woman, breaking his grasp in front of everyone. He stumbled back half a step, shock flashing across his face. The room held its breath again, but the shock didn't last. It twisted quickly into something uglier, rage thick with humiliation. He wasn't angry because she resisted. He was angry because she resisted him. And in his mind, that was unforgivable. Danielle tried once more, her voice calm despite the throbbing in her arm. I advise you not to continue this, she said gently. Please. Her restraint only fueled his fury. Oh, you're advising me now, he spat. You think you can talk to me like you matter? His fist tightened. The muscles in his jaw twitched. Officers shifted uneasily. Everyone in the room sensed it. Something bad was coming, something violent, something irreversible. But no one moved to stop it. No one stepped between them. No one said, "Lieutenant, that's enough." Silence protected him again. And in that silence, the worst part of him emerged. "You don't belong here," he snarled. "And I'm going to make sure you understand that." He raised his fist. Time slowed. Danielle saw his arm draw back. She saw the hatred in his eyes. She saw the room watching, frozen, complicit. She saw the man in the corner look away. She saw the young officer's lips part in horror. She saw the receptionist drop his phone. And she saw in one painful flash everything she had spent her life fighting. Cruelty disguised as authority, power without accountability, violence born from prejudice, a system that allowed men like Reynolds to believe they owned the world around them. And then, the punch, a brutal, unrestrained blow that crashed into her face with the force of years of entitlement. Her vision blurred, her body staggered, her heel clipped the corner of a table. She fell. Silence swallowed the room, then came laughter, cold, careless, dehumanizing. "Nice shot, Lieutenant." George, she won't talk back now. "That'll teach her." But beneath the laughter, something else stirred. Fear. Not for her, for themselves. Because deep down, even before they knew who she was, they sensed the truth. Something had gone too far. Danielle didn't cry out. She didn't beg. She didn't break. She pushed herself up slowly, painfully, refusing to let them see her fall in spirit. Reynolds stood above her, chest heaving, eyes wide, not with victory, but with the first flicker of dread. Because he realized, even if he couldn't explain it, he hadn't won. He had exposed himself, exposed the culture he represented, exposed the cruelty he relied on, exposed the system that protected him. And soon, very soon, he would pay for it. The crack in the system had begun. And Danielle Brooks, the woman he tried to humiliate, was the storm waiting to break him. The punch heard across the nation. The blow didn't just hit Danielle's face. It struck the entire room silent. The laughter that erupted immediately afterward cut deeper than the punch itself, sharp, heartless, echoing through the lobby as if her pain were entertainment. As Danielle lay on the floor, the cold linoleum pressing against her cheek, she heard snippets of cruel amusement. Well, that shut her up. She won't try that again. Lieutenant Reynolds always knows how to deal with trouble. Not everyone laughed. Some looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Some stared, frozen in shock. A few looked quietly horrified. But none of them spoke. None stepped forward. None said, "Enough." And that silence, more than the impact of the punch, was what carved itself deepest into her spirit. It was the silence she had known her entire life. The silence that protected aggressors, justified prejudice, enabled cruelty. The silence that once watched her brother be wrongfully detained. The silence that cost innocent men their freedom. The silence that made victims feel invisible. Now that same silence filled the police station she had been chosen to lead. Her vision blurred, colors melting at the edges. A warm sting spread across her cheek, throbbing as if her heartbeat had moved into her face. She tasted metal, blood, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the physical pain. But only for a moment, because the deeper pain wasn't physical. It was emotional, historical, human. It was the pain passed down through generations who had been struck, silenced, dismissed, ignored, and told their suffering was somehow their fault. She pushed her palm against the floor, steadying herself. The room went quiet, not out of compassion, but out of uncertainty. They didn't expect her to get up. Reynolds certainly didn't. He stood towering above her, chest puffed out like a man expecting applause. But instead of pride, something flickered across his face. Confusion. No matter how much power he wielded, he had not expected the woman he struck to rise again. And rise she did. Slowly, painfully, but upright, head held high. Danielle's left cheek was already swelling. A faint red imprint marked where Reynolds' knuckles had landed. Her vision steadied. Her breath returned to rhythm. She stared directly at him. That calm stare, stronger than any shout, unsettled him. Because cruelty felt powerful only when the victim stayed down. Her quiet strength made his violence look small, pathetic, shameful. Reynolds stumbled back half a step, not because she advanced, but because something shifted inside him. Fear, the first sign of consequence. He masked it quickly with anger. "You should have listened," he barked. "You think you can just stand here and—" But his voice trailed off. Because at that moment, an office door behind the lobby swung open sharply. Everyone turned. A man in his late 50s, graying hair neatly combed back, stepped out of the HR office holding a stack of folders. The papers nearly slipped from his hands when he saw Danielle. His eyes widened. He froze. The color drained from his face. "Good God," he whispered. "No, no, no." He hurried toward them, his voice cracking with panic. "What happened? Who?" But then he stopped in front of Danielle, and recognition struck him like lightning. His eyes locked onto her face, her swollen cheek, her steady posture, her unbroken gaze. "Chief Brooks," he breathed out. "Chief, what have they done?" The word hit the room like a bomb. "Chief." The laughter died instantly. The whispers choked out. The officers who had smirked now stiffened, posture snapping straight as realization washed over them. "Chief? Chief," someone whispered behind the desk. "No, no way," another muttered. "That's her?" A younger officer breathed, voice trembling. But the HR manager, Samuel Green, confirmed the truth with panic in his voice. "This is Chief Danielle Brooks," he shouted, turning toward everyone. "Our newly appointed chief of police." Silence fell so sharply it hurt. Reynolds blinked, confusion swirling across his face like smoke. For a moment, he looked genuinely lost. "Chief?" he repeated softly, as if trying to convince himself he had heard incorrectly. Danielle didn't answer. She simply stood there, breathing steadily. Her presence was enough. "No," Reynolds muttered. His throat tightened. Sweat formed at his temples. His hands, moments ago clenched with certainty, now shook slightly. "No, no, it can't." But denial couldn't save him. Not from what he had done. Not from the witnesses who had seen it. Not from the consequences that now loomed like a storm over his head. Suddenly, Emily Foster, the HR assistant, came rushing out of the office, papers clutched in her hands. "Mr. Green, I double-checked the files. Her appointment was effective this morning." "This is her," she announced, voice trembling. The officers who had laughed now swallowed hard. Some stepped back as if distance might erase their complicity. Others lowered their heads in shame. A few exchanged terrified glances. Everyone knew what had just happened. They hadn't mistreated a civilian. They had mistreated their new chief. And Lieutenant Reynolds had assaulted her. Danielle watched them, not with anger, but with a painfully quiet understanding. This moment wasn't about her pride. It wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about truth, about revealing a culture that had gone unchecked for far too long, about showing exactly why reform was necessary. Reynolds swallowed hard. The pride that once inflated his posture had crumbled into panic. "Chief," he stammered, trying to regain composure. I didn't know. If I had known, I would never have." He stopped himself, because there was no right way to finish a sentence like that. There was no excuse. Danielle didn't say a word. She simply looked at him, calm, composed, and deeply disappointed. That silence, her silence, felt like judgment in its purest form. Reynolds stepped back again, voice cracking. This is a misunderstanding," he insisted. A complete misunderstanding." But the truth was too obvious, too undeniable. He hadn't attacked her because she was a stranger. He attacked her because he thought she was powerless, because she was a black woman, because he believed authority belonged to him, because he believed cruelty had no consequences. Now consequences stood before him. Samuel Green turned toward the other officers. "Someone call internal affairs, now," he ordered. But Danielle lifted a hand gently. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it commanded the room instantly. "I will handle this myself." Every officer froze. She stepped forward slowly. No anger, no raised voice, no theatrical rage. Just controlled authority. Something stronger than fear spread through the room. Respect. True respect. Not the forced obedience Reynolds had demanded. Not the false loyalty built on intimidation. Real respect. Danielle turned to the nearest pair of officers. "Arrest Lieutenant Reynolds," she said. Her tone was steady, unshaken. It carried dignity, justice, and history all at once. The room erupted, not with sound, but with movement. Two officers exchanged terrified glances. They didn't want to do it. Reynolds had been their superior, their protector, their symbol of the culture they'd followed for years. But now he was just a man who had crossed a line that could not be crossed. Slowly, reluctantly, they stepped toward him. "Chief, wait," Reynolds stuttered, backing away. "Please, this isn't necessary." The officers grabbed his arms. He jerked wildly, panic exploding through him. "Get your hands off me," he shouted. "I'm a lieutenant. You can't do this." But they could, and they did. Cold metal cuffs clicked around his wrists. His eyes widened at the sound. He was no longer in control. He was no longer feared. He was no longer untouchable. "Chief Brooks," he pleaded desperately, I didn't know who you were. If I had known. Danielle looked at him, her voice soft but unbreakable. "And that is the problem." Reynolds' breath caught in his throat. "You treat people based on who you think they are," she continued, "not based on the respect every human being deserves." The officers paused, stunned by the truth in her words. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calmness struck harder than Reynolds' punch ever could. "This didn't happen because you didn't know me," she said. "This happened because you didn't care." A tremor ran through the room. Guilt, shame, realization. Reynolds lowered his head, breath shaky. "Escort him out," Danielle commanded. The officers led him away. His boots scraped against the floor, a sound that echoed louder than the laughter earlier. Every step was a reminder of arrogance punished, of authority wrongly used, of justice finally catching up. The door closed behind him with a finality that shook the entire department. Silence returned, but this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of complicity, it was the silence of awakening. Danielle turned slowly, looking at every face in the room. Officers who had watched cruelty happen, officers who had laughed, officers who had stayed silent. She didn't yell. She didn't shame them. She simply let the truth settle in the air. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft but carried the weight of everything they'd witnessed. "I hope today shows all of us how far we have to go," she said. Not one person moved. "This department will not continue on the path you saw this morning," she continued. "Not under my leadership, not under this badge, not in this city." Some officers lowered their heads. Some blinked back tears. Some stood frozen, unable to process the shift taking place. For the first time in years, maybe decades, someone in power was holding a mirror to their culture, and the reflection was painful. Danielle's gaze softened, not with weakness, but with compassion. "Change doesn't begin with punishment," she said. "It begins with truth." And now the truth was undeniable. She lifted her chin slightly, standing in the center of the lobby, with a presence no one could ignore. "Let today be the moment we decide who we want to be," she said, "not just as officers, not just as a department, but as human beings." Her words settled in the air like a promise and a challenge. A new era had begun, and the pain that filled the room wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. Revelation. "The woman they beat is the chief's silence," clung to the air like heavy smoke. It wasn't the silence of peace or calm, it was the silence of reckoning, the kind that settles only after something irreversible has been revealed. Danielle Brooks stood in the center of the lobby, the swelling on her cheek visible beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, but her posture straight, her presence unmoving. Every officer who moments earlier had laughed now avoided her eyes. Every officer who had watched silently now wished they could rewind time. Every officer who thought they understood power now felt its true meaning for the first time. The truth had stripped the room bare. She wasn't a civilian. She wasn't an activist. She wasn't someone they could dismiss. She was the chief of police, the first black woman ever appointed to lead the Birmingham Police Department, and they had treated her as if she were nothing. Samuel Green, the HR manager, wiped sweat from his forehead. Panic still shook his hands. The image of Danielle on the floor, Reynolds' fist connecting with her face, that image would haunt him. He looked around the room and saw what Danielle saw, a culture that had stopped recognizing humanity. We need to gather statements, he said shakily. Immediately. But before he could call anyone over, Danielle lifted a hand. Later, she said softly. There are more pressing matters. Her voice held no anger, but it held truth, and that truth carried more authority than a shout ever could. Two officers escorted the handcuffed Lieutenant Reynolds across the lobby. His earlier bravado had dissolved. He looked disoriented, almost fragile, the weight of consequences settling onto his shoulders. This is wrong, he muttered. This is a setup. He twisted slightly, trying to pull free, but the cuffs held. You all know me. You know I would never. But the words died in his throat, because the truth hung around him like a shadow. He had done it, not out of mistake, not out of confusion, but out of bias, out of arrogance, out of a belief that his authority was absolute and unquestionable. An older officer who had laughed earlier now stared at the floor, his face pale, his jaw tight. He had known Reynolds for nearly 2 decades. They had shared coffee breaks, jokes, and cases. Yet in the deepest part of his heart, he had always known moments like this were possible, that the system they served gave men like Reynolds too much room to harm without consequence. Now the consequences have arrived. As Reynolds passed by Danielle, he tried one last attempt to save himself. Chief, he pleaded, voice cracking, I didn't know. If I had known. Danielle looked him directly in the eyes, her expression calm but unyielding. The problem, she said quietly, is that you should not need to know someone's title to treat them with dignity. The words landed harder than any punishment could. Reynolds lowered his gaze, and for a brief moment, the entire room felt the weight of its own guilt. The two officers pulled him away, heading for the internal holding area. His voice broke into desperate protests. You're making a mistake. You all know me. This isn't fair. You can't do this to me. I'm a lieutenant. But titles had lost their meaning. The only thing that mattered now was the truth. As the door shut behind Reynolds, the heavy metal echo vibrated through the lobby. The officers remaining stood scattered, uncertain, uncomfortable. Danielle turned slowly, letting her eyes pass across every face in the room. Some flinched when her gaze reached them. Others stiffened their shoulders, bracing for reprimand. But Danielle didn't yell. She wasn't ashamed. She didn't weaponize her authority. Instead, she offered something far more powerful: accountability with compassion. You all witnessed what happened, she began. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. And I am not here to punish the entire department. Some officers exhaled shakily. Others tensed, sensing there was more to come. I am here, she continued, because this cannot happen again. Not to me, not to any citizen, not to any colleague. Her words held every ounce of history, every ounce of struggle that made this moment necessary. She stepped forward, slowly, purposefully. This department has forgotten what justice looks like, she said. It has forgotten the weight of the badge. It has forgotten that every person who walks through those doors, regardless of color, gender, or status, deserves respect. A young officer in the back swallowed hard. She had joined the force only 2 years ago, full of hope. But the longer she worked here, the more she learned to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to follow the culture rather than challenge it. Now, watching Danielle stand injured but unbroken, something inside her shifted. Danielle continued, I didn't come here today to expose anyone, she said. I came to understand the culture I was stepping into. And what I witnessed was painful, but necessary. Painful. Necessary. Those 2 words pierced the room, because every person knew they were true. Danielle gestured gently to the spot on the floor where she had fallen. I will heal, she said. But the question is, will this department heal too? The lobby fell into silence once more. But this silence wasn't empty or cowardly. It was reflective. It was the sound of people finally seeing themselves clearly. An officer near the back spoke up timidly. "Chief Brooks," he said, voice trembling, I'm sorry. We all should have stepped in. We should have stopped him." Danielle nodded slowly. "Thank you," she replied. "Accountability doesn't begin with excuses. It begins with acknowledgement." Another officer spoke, an older black man who had been in the department longer than most. "Chief," he said quietly, "things have been this way a long time. People look the other way because it's easier than standing up. We stopped believing things could change." She met his eyes with warmth. "And do you believe it now?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he whispered, "because you're standing here." Danielle felt emotion swell in her chest, not pride but responsibility, the kind that comes when someone finally sees hope where they once saw none. She turned back to the room. "We will move forward," she said, "but we cannot move forward pretending nothing happened. Lieutenant Reynolds will face full disciplinary review. Those who enabled him will be investigated. And reforms start today, not tomorrow." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Some officers looked terrified, some relieved, some ashamed. But all of them understood. A chapter of the department's history had just closed. And a new chapter, one built on justice rather than fear, was beginning. Within the hour, higher-ranking officials arrived. Meetings were called, statements collected, surveillance footage reviewed. Reynolds, now isolated in a holding cell, oscillated between anger and panic. The weight of his actions pressed harder the longer he sat alone. His shouts of innocence echoed back at him unheard. Evidence of his behavior, long tolerated, began surfacing. Past complaints buried by friends, misconduct quietly dismissed, reports massaged until the truth disappeared. There was no hiding now. Not from the new chief, not from the public, not from himself. Danielle attended the emergency meeting of senior officials. Though her cheek still throbbed and her head ached from the impact, she carried herself with unwavering composure. Inside the conference room, thick folders lay scattered across the table. Reynolds' previous complaints, witness statements, HR reports. A deputy chief flipped through the pages, his face tightening. "This is worse than we thought," he murmured. "He should have been removed years ago." Another official nodded soberly. "We cannot allow him to stay on the force. This isn't just about today. This is about every day he represents this department." There was no debate. Reynolds was terminated. But more than that, disciplinary action was taken against those who enabled him, those who stayed silent, those who laughed, those who buried complaints, those who normalized cruelty. A quiet earthquake rippled through the department. Not destruction, rebirth. Danielle left the meeting room to find officers gathered in clusters, speaking in low voices. Some looked frightened, some hope. Some are confused, struggling to reconcile the old culture with the one emerging. She paused in the hallway, feeling the weight of change settle on her shoulders. Her cheek still burned, her ribs ached, but none of that diminished her resolve. Pain had always been part of the journey, but so was the transformation. A young female officer approached her hesitantly. "Chief Brooks," she said softly, "I just wanted to say what happened today. It opened my eyes, and I want to help. I want this place to be better." Danielle smiled gently. "Then you've already taken the first step," she said. "Change begins with the willingness to do better." The officer nodded, tears forming in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she believed the department could change. And that was the power of leadership. Not command, not intimidation, but vision. A vision rooted in humanity. That night, news of the incident spread across social media like wildfire. Videos from surveillance cameras leaked. Anonymous staff members provided details to reporters. Every major news station carried the story. Racist lieutenant assaults new black police chief in lobby. Violence, racism, and accountability. Birmingham PD under fire. Chief Danielle Brooks takes decisive action after brutal incident. The nation watched. The world watched. And for the first time, many people felt something they hadn't felt in years when it came to policing. Hope. Pain still filled the city. Anger swirled. Questions rose. But hope, real, human hope, gleamed through the darkness. because people saw a leader who didn't retaliate through anger, but through justice. A leader who didn't shame her officers, but challenged them to rise. A leader who believed in accountability, not revenge. A leader who believed in humanity. Danielle Brooks had walked into the department as nobody in their eyes, but by the end of that day, everyone understood who she truly was. A woman strong enough to endure injustice, brave enough to face corruption, and compassionate enough to lead broken people toward healing. She didn't erase the pain, she transformed it, and that transformation had only just begun. Part 8. A New America Begins With Us. The sun rose slowly over Birmingham the next morning, casting a warm glow across the city, as if attempting to heal what had been wounded the day before. But inside the police department, the atmosphere was still heavy, heavier than the humid air, heavier than the echoes of yesterday's incident. Change, real change, always carries weight. Word had already spread far beyond the walls of the building. Phones buzzed relentlessly. Emails flooded inboxes. Reporters camped outside the department with cameras ready, waiting for any sign of the new chief whose first day had erupted into national news. The story was everywhere. A lieutenant punched the new black police chief. Other officers laughed. The chief stood back up. And then she demanded accountability. Some people were outraged. Some were heartbroken. But many were inspired. And behind all the headlines stood Danielle Brooks, calm, resolute, and preparing for what must come next. 2 days after the incident, a press conference was scheduled outside City Hall. A podium had been placed on the steps. Microphones from local stations and national networks crowded the small platform. Behind the barricade stood hundreds of Birmingham residents, activists, clergy, students, and families holding signs. Justice for all. End police racism. We stand with Chief Brooks. Respect our community. The energy was electric, but not chaotic. People weren't just angry, they were hopeful. Danielle arrived quietly, flanked not by officers but by community leaders. Her cheek had healed slightly, though faint discoloration remained. A reminder of the violence she endured, but also of the resilience she embodied. When she appeared on the steps, the crowd erupted in applause. Warm, thunderous, emotional applause that carried gratitude and belief. She paused at the podium. The cheers faded. Silence settled with reverence. And then she spoke. "I didn't accept this role to maintain a broken system," she said, her voice strong and steady. "I accepted it to change it." The words rippled across the courtyard, carried by microphones and cameras to millions of homes. "I stand before you not as a victim," she continued, "but as someone who believes deeply in justice, dignity, and humanity. What happened in that lobby was painful, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever felt unheard, unseen, disrespected, or mistreated by those in power." Many in the crowd nodded, some wiping tears. This was not just a speech, it was a reflection of their lived experiences. Danielle's voice softened, but her tone never wavered. "I want to make something very clear. The problem is not anger. Anger is a signal that something is wrong. The problem is when we ignore it. The problem is when we allow a culture to grow where cruelty is tolerated, where silence is rewarded, and where humanity is forgotten." She lifted her gaze toward the crowd, toward every citizen watching, every officer listening somewhere inside the department, every child who might someday wear a badge or fear one. "But we can change this," she said. "We can choose something better. We can choose compassion. We can choose fairness. We can choose to stand up for one another." Her words settled into every heart present, heavy with meaning, but light with hope. Behind the press area, a group of young activists held a banner that read, "We believe in a better Birmingham." Danielle nodded to them gently before continuing. "This change will not be easy. It will take courage. It will require us to confront uncomfortable truths, truths about our department, about our city, and about ourselves. But I promise you this, anyone in my police force who abuses their authority, who discriminates, who undermines the dignity of another human being, that person will be removed." Applause erupted, this time not wild but respectful, affirming. A reporter raised a hand. Danielle gestured for her to speak. "Chief Brooks," the woman asked, After everything that happened, what gives you the strength to move forward without anger? Danielle paused. A gentle smile touched her lips. Because I've seen anger divide communities, she said. I've seen hatred poison hearts. But I've also seen love heal wounds. I've seen unity outshine fear. I've seen people rise above what was meant to break them. She took a breath, her voice warm with conviction. I choose to lead with love because love is stronger than hate. I choose compassion because compassion builds bridges where anger builds walls. And I choose justice because justice is the only path toward a stronger, safer, more united America. The crowd erupted once more, not in applause alone, but in emotion. Some people cried, some held hands, some whispered prayers. For many, this was the first time they felt hope from someone in uniform. Later that afternoon, Danielle walked through the department once more. Not undercover this time, not invisible, not dismissed. Officers straightened when she passed. Some offered quiet apologies. Some looked ashamed. Others looked relieved, grateful that someone finally had the strength to stand where they had been afraid to. One young officer approached her timidly. Chief Brooks, she said, I want to be part of the solution. I want to learn how to do better. Danielle smiled. That's how change begins, she replied. Not with perfection, but with willingness. Another officer, a man who had witnessed the assault but looked away, stepped forward. I failed you, he said quietly. I failed what this badge stands for. But I want to earn back the right to wear it with honor. Danielle's voice was gentle. Accountability is not the end, she said. It's the beginning. What matters now is who you choose to be moving forward. Many in the department that day realized something profound. Leadership isn't about rank. It's about humanity. And Danielle had shown them what humanity looked like under pressure. That evening, as she left the building, the sun was setting in streaks of gold and amber. Birmingham felt different. Not fixed, not yet, but shifting. The wound was open, but so was the path to healing. A group of community members waited outside the door. Not reporters, not protesters, just ordinary people. A mother stepped forward with her son, a boy no older than 10. Chief Brooks, she said softly, my son wanted to tell you something. The boy looked up, clutching his mother's hand. You're brave, he whispered, and you make me feel safe. Danielle felt her throat tighten. She knelt down, smiling gently at him. Thank you, and I want you to know something too. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve to be treated with respect. Never forget that. The boy nodded, eyes wide with admiration. Moments like that, Danielle knew, were why she had fought so hard, why she endured the pain. Why did she stand tall even when she was struck down? Because the fight wasn't only for her. It was for every child who needed hope. Every community yearns for fairness. Every officer who wanted to serve with integrity. Every citizen who wanted to trust again. The fight was for America. An America still unfinished, still flawed, but still striving. As Danielle walked toward her car, the evening breeze felt lighter, as if the city itself exhaled after holding its breath for too long. She paused, looking back at the police department rising behind her. This is just the beginning, she whispered. And it was. A beginning not rooted in anger, but in justice. Not driven by punishment, but by transformation. Not divided by race, but united by humanity. A new chapter for Birmingham. A new chapter for policing. A new chapter for every person who had ever been silenced. And through the pain, through the struggle, through the courage it took to stand tall, a new America began to rise. An America where people rejected racism, embraced kindness, lifted each other up, and chose love over hate. An America stronger, braver, and more compassionate than the one before. And Danielle Brooks, the woman who walked into a police station unseen, had become the symbol of that new beginning. What happened in that police station was more than a brutal moment. It was a reminder of the work we still have to do. A reminder that racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides in silence, in laughter, in the corners of institutions that were meant to protect us. But it was also a reminder of something even stronger. Courage, dignity, humanity. and the power of one person standing tall in the face of injustice. Chief Danielle Brooks showed us that change doesn't begin with anger. It begins with truth. It begins with accountability. It begins with the willingness to say, we can be better than this. And that is the lesson we carry forward today. If we want a stronger America, if we want an America where every child grows up feeling safe, if we want an America where love is louder than hate, then we must stand with one another. We must lift each other up. We must refuse to stay silent when we witness wrongdoing. And above all, we must believe that unity, compassion, and justice can still win. This story is not just about a police chief. It is about all of us, about the America we choose to build each day through our actions, our voices, and our willingness to love beyond difference. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, if it reminded you of the kind of country we can become, make sure you subscribe to the Racist Reality channel so you never miss another powerful story like this. And don't stop here. Visit the channel and watch more videos, because every story we share is a step toward justice, empathy, and a better future for us all. Together, we can build an America that stands taller, loves harder, and refuses to tolerate hate in any form. Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stay compassionate, and stay united.